Kentucky is a state shaped by contradiction, resilience, and constant transformation. From its earliest days as indigenous hunting grounds to its rise as the 15th state in the Union, Kentucky has stood at the crossroads of American history. Its fertile bluegrass fields, rugged Appalachian mountains, and powerful river systems helped shape not only its economy, but its identity. During the Civil War, Kentucky was a divided border state, loyal to the Union yet deeply tied to the South. Families were split, loyalties were tested, and the legacy of slavery left scars that would influence generations. Reconstruction brought freedom, but not equality. Coal mines, tobacco fields, and railroads fueled economic growth, yet also created hardship and labor conflict, especially in the Appalachian region. The Great Depression devastated communities, but New Deal programs modernized infrastructure and electrified rural areas. World War II transformed Kentucky into a vital military and industrial center. The civil rights movement reshaped laws and institutions, pushing the state toward integration and reform. In the late 20th century, coal declined, manufacturing diversified, and political identities shifted. In the modern era, Kentucky faces new challenges: economic transition, healthcare debates, environmental concerns, and technological change, while holding tightly to traditions like the Kentucky Derby, college basketball, bourbon heritage, and Appalachian culture. This is not just the story of a state, it is the story of adaptation under pressure. From frontier wilderness to global industry, from division to reform, Kentucky's journey reflects the broader American experience. If you enjoy deep, calm, detailed history like this, make sure to subscribe and join us as we continue exploring the complete stories behind America's states, one chapter at a time. Number 1. Ancient land. Long before Kentucky carried a name, before maps traced its rivers or borders claimed its valleys, the land existed in a quiet and powerful rhythm of its own. Vast forests stretched across rolling hills, broken only by winding waterways that shimmered under changing skies. The Ohio River flowed steadily along the northern edge, while smaller rivers like the Kentucky, Cumberland, and Green carved deep paths through limestone and earth. Beneath the soil lay caves, miles upon miles of hidden chambers slowly forming in darkness. The land was not empty, it was alive, breathing through wind in the trees and movement across open plains. Herds of ancient animals traveled established paths that would later guide human feet. This region, rich in resources and shaped by water, climate, and stone, was preparing quietly for human presence long before recorded history began. Thousands of years ago, the first people arrived in what we now call Kentucky. They came during the Paleo-Indian period, moving carefully through a colder world shaped by the final ice age. These early inhabitants were skilled hunters, following large game such as mammoths and mastodons across open landscapes. Their tools, crafted from stone, reveal careful design and remarkable adaptability. Clovis points, sharp and symmetrical, have been discovered across the region, offering silent proof of their presence. These people lived lightly on the land, traveling in small groups, adapting constantly to changing climates and migrating animals. Kentucky's rivers provided fresh water and natural pathways, while its forests offered shelter and food. Life required awareness and patience. Survival depended not on dominance, but on understanding the land's patterns and respecting its power. As the climate gradually warmed and large ice age animals disappeared, life in Kentucky began to change. The Archaic period brought new rhythms. Forests grew denser, rivers settled into more familiar courses, and smaller game replaced the massive creatures of the past. The people adapted once again. Hunting strategies shifted. Fishing became more important. Shell middens, piles of discarded shells along riverbanks, tell us that freshwater mussels were a reliable food source. Communities became slightly less nomadic, returning seasonally to familiar grounds. Tools diversified, including grinding stones for processing plants. The people learned which roots healed, which berries nourished, and which trees offered the strongest wood. Kentucky was no longer simply a place to pass through. It was becoming a homeland shaped by repeated movement and memory. Over centuries, patterns of settlement deepened. During the woodland period, pottery began to appear, marking a significant cultural shift. The creation of clay vessels allowed for better storage and cooking, changing daily life in quiet but meaningful ways. Small burial mounds rose from the earth, carefully constructed and symbolically important. These mounds were not random. They reflected belief systems, rituals, and connections between the living and the dead. Trade networks expanded beyond Kentucky's borders. Materials such as copper and marine shells traveled long distances, showing that even in ancient times, this region was connected to broader cultural systems. Kentucky's rivers acted as highways of exchange, carrying goods and ideas. The land was no longer isolated wilderness, it was part of a growing web of human interaction. By the time the Mississippian culture emerged around 1000 CE, Kentucky had become part of an advanced and organized world. Though major Mississippian cities like Cahokia lay to the west, influences reached into Kentucky's western regions. Agricultural practices expanded, especially the cultivation of maize. Farming supported larger populations and more permanent settlements. Social hierarchies became clearer, and ceremonial life grew more structured. Earthwork mounds became more elaborate, serving as platforms for buildings and rituals. Villages formed near fertile river valleys where crops could thrive. Life was no longer defined solely by survival. It was shaped by ceremony, community, and shared identity. Kentucky's fertile soil supported not just food, but culture itself. Yet even as societies grew more complex, Kentucky remained somewhat unique. Unlike regions with massive urban centers, much of Kentucky continued to serve as shared hunting ground rather than permanent dense settlement. The abundance of wildlife made it valuable to surrounding tribes. Bison traveled through open canebrakes, creating trails that would later be called the Buffalo Traces. These natural highways cut through forests and across rivers, forming paths that humans followed for generations. The land became both resource and meeting place, sometimes peaceful, sometimes contested. Different nations understood its value, and its use required balance. Kentucky was not owned in the European sense. It was respected, visited, and utilized through seasonal movement. Spiritual life was deeply connected to landscape. Rivers were more than water sources. They were living presences. Caves held mystery and sacred meaning. The vast Mammoth Cave system, though not fully explored in ancient times, was known and entered. Torches left soot marks on cave ceilings, proof of early exploration. What rituals occurred within those dark chambers remains partly unknown, but archaeological evidence suggests ceremonial significance. The land shaped belief. The changing seasons guided ritual calendars. Planting, harvesting, hunting, each carried spiritual importance. Kentucky's hills and valleys were not silent backdrops. They were active participants in daily and sacred life. Conflict also touched the region long before Europeans arrived. As populations shifted and resources were contested, warfare became part of the human story. Fortified villages appeared in some areas, suggesting the need for defense. Kentucky's position between powerful native nations made it both crossroads and contested ground. The Shawnee, Cherokee, and other tribes would later consider it sacred hunting territory, but even before their dominance, the land experienced cycles of alliance and rivalry. Control of rich hunting grounds meant survival and influence. The story of Kentucky was never static. It was shaped by movement, adaptation, and occasional struggle. Trade continued to shape identity. Stone from Kentucky traveled outward, while exotic materials traveled inward. Cultural exchange was not merely economic. It influenced art, tools, and ritual practices. Pottery designs reflected shared symbols. Burial customs evolved. Kentucky was part of a living continent-wide conversation long before colonial borders existed. This challenges the myth of isolation. Instead, ancient Kentucky was dynamic, connected, and culturally layered. And through it all, nature remained powerful. Floods reshaped riverbanks, storms flattened forests, wildlife populations shifted with climate patterns. The people who lived here understood that stability was temporary. Adaptation was constant. Kentucky demanded awareness. It rewarded knowledge passed from generation to generation. By the eve of European contact, Kentucky stood as a richly layered land. Ancient footprints lay buried beneath soil. Forgotten villages rested beneath forests. Buffalo traces cut quietly through trees. The rivers still flowed as they always had. But change was approaching. The next chapter of Kentucky's history would bring outsiders who misunderstood the land as empty wilderness. Yet the ground they stepped on held thousands of years of memory, and those memories would not disappear easily. As centuries passed, the cultures connected to Kentucky's landscape continued to shift in quiet but meaningful ways. The Mississippian influence that had once touched western Kentucky began to wane after the 1300s. Larger ceremonial centers declined, and populations reorganized into smaller communities. The reasons were complex: climate changes, resource pressures, political tensions. But the result was clear: Kentucky once again became more of a shared ground than a densely settled core. Forests slowly reclaimed abandoned clearings. Earthwork mounds stood as silent reminders of societies that had flourished and transformed. Yet the land did not become empty. Instead, it became a meeting space, valued for hunting, travel, and strategic movement between stronger population centers in surrounding regions. The vast herds of bison that roamed Kentucky played a crucial role in this transformation. Their repeated migrations carved deep, visible pathways across the terrain. These buffalo traces wound through forests, crossed shallow rivers, and cut through mountain gaps. For native nations, these trails became efficient travel routes, shaping seasonal movement and trade. They were not random lines, but living maps created by nature itself. Following these paths required knowledge: where water pooled after rain, where predators lurked, where land rose steeply. Over time, these natural highways became embedded in cultural memory. Generations would walk them, turning animal instinct into human infrastructure long before roads were imagined. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Kentucky's role as contested hunting territory became more pronounced. Powerful nations such as the Shawnee to the north and the Cherokee to the south valued its rich game and fertile river valleys. Yet few built permanent large-scale towns within its borders. Instead, Kentucky became neutral ground at times and battleground at others. Hunting parties entered seasonally, fully aware of the risks. The abundance of deer, elk, and bison made the danger worthwhile. Control over Kentucky's resources meant leverage in broader regional power struggles. Its geography, bridging the Ohio Valley in the southeast, made it strategically essential. Spiritual traditions remained deeply connected to Kentucky's natural features. Rivers were pathways not only for trade but for stories. Oral histories tied certain valleys and ridges to ancestral events. Caves continued to hold sacred importance. Archaeological discoveries within Mammoth Cave have revealed ancient cane torches and footprints preserved in mineral-rich earth. Some chambers appear to have been used for mineral extraction, particularly gypsum, which may have held ceremonial value. Entering the cave system required courage and purpose. Darkness inside those caverns was complete, broken only by flickering torchlight. The decision to descend into that hidden world reflects both practical need and spiritual depth. Meanwhile, trade networks across North America expanded further. Even before Europeans arrived in Kentucky, indirect contact with European goods began altering indigenous life elsewhere on the continent. Metal tools and weapons, introduced along coastal regions, slowly filtered inland through exchange systems. By the time direct European explorers approached Kentucky's borders in the 1600s and early 1700s, native societies were already adapting to distant changes. The introduction of firearms would eventually reshape hunting and warfare dynamics. But at this stage, Kentucky remained largely within indigenous systems of movement and exchange, though pressure from expanding colonial settlements was drawing closer each year. Disease, however, traveled faster than settlers. Epidemics introduced through indirect contact devastated native populations across eastern North America. Though Kentucky did not host dense urban centers, its surrounding nations suffered losses that destabilized political balances. Population decline intensified competition over territory. In some areas, formerly occupied lands were left temporarily vacant, not because they were unused, but because communities had been weakened. This demographic shock altered the rhythm of the region. Kentucky's identity as shared hunting ground became even more contested as surviving nations sought to maintain strength amid growing uncertainty. By the early 1700s, European colonial ambitions were pressing toward the Appalachian Mountains. French and British powers both sought influence over the Ohio Valley. Though Kentucky itself had not yet seen permanent European settlement, it was already entangled in imperial rivalry. Native alliances became strategically important. Control of Kentucky's rivers meant influence over trade and military movement. The land's value was now recognized by distant empires that had never seen its forests. Maps began to include its outlines, though they rarely reflected the complex indigenous relationships that defined it. Explorers occasionally entered Kentucky during this time, often guided by native knowledge. They described fertile soil, abundant wildlife, and navigable rivers. To European eyes, the region appeared as opportunity, rich farmland waiting to be claimed. Yet this interpretation misunderstood its reality. Kentucky was not unused wilderness. It was carefully understood terrain, layered with generations of movement and meaning. The buffalo traces that Europeans admired were the product of centuries of indigenous knowledge. The rivers that seemed like commercial highways were sacred arteries long before they were economic assets. Tensions gradually intensified as colonial expansion pushed westward. The Appalachian Barrier, once seen as natural protection, became an obstacle to overcome. Stories of Kentucky's richness spread among settlers eager for land. Meanwhile, native nations recognized the threat. Kentucky's role as shared hunting ground meant its loss would weaken multiple communities at once. The stage was being set for confrontation, not immediate, but inevitable. The balance that had defined Kentucky for centuries was beginning to shift under the weight of distant political forces. Still, on the eve of sustained European exploration, Kentucky retained its ancient character. Forest canopies filtered sunlight onto thick undergrowth. Rivers ran clear and untamed. Bison moved in heavy herds across open canebrakes. Smoke from seasonal camps rose briefly into the sky before fading back into wilderness. Life followed seasonal cycles, guided by ecological knowledge passed orally from one generation to the next. The land felt expansive, powerful, and deeply rooted in indigenous presence. What made Kentucky unique at this moment was its position. It was not the political heart of any single native empire, yet it was essential to many. It was crossroads, corridor, and resource basin. Its strength lay in its abundance and accessibility. Whoever controlled Kentucky would influence movement between the Great Lakes and the Deep South, between the Atlantic coast and the Mississippi River. Geography was destiny, though few yet understood how dramatically that destiny would unfold. Soon, figures like long hunters and land speculators would cross the mountains. Trails once shaped by bison would guide them westward. Forts would rise where seasonal camps once stood. Treaties, often unequal, would attempt to formalize claims to land long understood differently by indigenous nations. Kentucky's ancient balance would face its greatest transformation. But in this moment, before permanent European settlement took hold, Kentucky still belonged to its first rhythms. The land remembered mammoth hunts and mound builders. It remembered trade routes and torch-lit caves. It remembered generations who understood that survival meant harmony with forest, river, and stone. Change was coming, and it would reshape Kentucky forever. By the mid-18th century, the quiet balance that had defined Kentucky for thousands of years was nearing its end. The Appalachian Mountains, once a formidable barrier separating coastal colonies from the interior, were no longer an impenetrable wall. Traders, surveyors, and long hunters began slipping through mountain gaps, drawn by stories of fertile valleys and endless game. Among indigenous nations, anxiety grew. Kentucky had long been a shared hunting ground, valuable precisely because no single power fully controlled it. But European land hunger operated under a different philosophy. To colonial settlers, land was not shared, it was claimed, fenced, and permanently occupied. This difference in worldview would become the central conflict shaping Kentucky's transition from ancient homeland to contested frontier. Long hunters from Virginia and North Carolina entered Kentucky in the 1760s, sometimes staying for months at a time. They followed buffalo traces, marveling at their direct routes through dense forest. They hunted deer for skins, which could be sold in eastern markets. Their journals described a paradise of open meadows, cane fields, and salt licks crowded with animals. Yet their glowing descriptions masked a deeper reality. These lands were not empty. Native hunting parties moved through them seasonally, aware of every stream crossing and ridgeline. The arrival of long hunters disrupted carefully maintained balances. Skirmishes began to increase, signaling that Kentucky's long era as relatively shared space was closing. The 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, intensified European competition for the Ohio Valley. Although Kentucky did not host major battles during this conflict, its strategic value became undeniable. Control of interior river systems meant control of trade and military mobility. When Britain emerged victorious in 1763, it claimed vast territories west of the Appalachians. Yet, in an attempt to stabilize relations with native nations, the British Crown issued the Proclamation of 1763, temporarily forbidding colonial settlement west of the mountains. On paper, Kentucky was protected from expansion. In practice, settlers ignored the boundary, and enforcement proved impossible across such rugged terrain. Treaties soon followed, reshaping Kentucky's political future. Agreements such as the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768 attempted to formalize land transfers between British officials and certain native representatives. These treaties were often controversial even among indigenous nations, as not all groups recognized the authority of those who signed. For colonial land speculators, however, the treaties provided legal justification for claiming Kentucky acreage. Companies formed to survey and divide the land. Maps were drawn with straight lines that did not reflect centuries of seasonal movement and shared usage. The ancient understanding of Kentucky as common ground was being replaced by deeds and property titles. Daniel Boone's exploration through the Cumberland Gap in 1769 symbolized this turning point. Guided by earlier knowledge and native trails, Boone traveled into central Kentucky and described its promise enthusiastically. His report spread rapidly among settlers hungry for opportunity. Boone did not discover Kentucky. Indigenous nations had known it intimately for generations, but his journeys made it widely visible to colonial audiences. By 1775, Boone helped establish Boonesboro, one of the first permanent European settlements in the region. Its construction marked a shift from temporary hunting camps to enduring occupation. Violence followed swiftly. Native resistance intensified as settlements multiplied. Kentucky's transformation from hunting ground to colony threatened both resources and sovereignty. Raids and counter-raids became frequent. The American Revolutionary War further complicated matters. Some native nations allied with the British, hoping to slow colonial expansion. Frontier forts in Kentucky became defensive strongholds. Life inside them was tense, shaped by fear of attack and uncertainty about survival. Yet migration did not stop. If anything, conflict reinforced settlers' determination to secure the land permanently. During these turbulent years, Kentucky's geography proved decisive.
Rivers allowed supplies and reinforcements to move westward despite mountain barriers. Fertile soil rewarded those who risked settlement. The buffalo traces, once shaped by animal instinct and indigenous knowledge, became the foundations for roads that funneled thousands of newcomers into the region. What had been seasonal pathways evolved into migration corridors. Cabins replaced temporary camps, fields replaced forests. The transformation accelerated rapidly. For native nations, the consequences were devastating. Continuous conflict compounded by earlier disease outbreaks, weakened resistance, treaties signed under pressure forced land cessions. By the 1790s, organized indigenous presence within Kentucky had been largely displaced, though connections to the land never fully disappeared. The region that had once served as sacred hunting territory was now structured around private ownership and expanding agriculture. The ancient rhythms of seasonal movement gave way to fence boundaries and permanent towns. In 1792, Kentucky achieved statehood as the 15th state of the United States. This milestone symbolized more than political admission. It marked the completion of a profound transformation. In less than a century, Kentucky had shifted from indigenous crossroads to American frontier state. Yet beneath farms and emerging towns lay layers of older history. Mounds still rose quietly in fields. Cave soot marks still traced ancient torch paths. Buffalo traces remained embedded beneath early roads. The past had not vanished, it had been covered. Even as settlers celebrated progress, the land carried memory. Rivers continued flowing along ancient channels. Limestone caves preserved footprints of those who walked there thousands of years before. Forest clearings sometimes revealed fragments of pottery or stone tools, silent reminders of earlier civilizations. Kentucky's soil became a layered archive, prehistoric, indigenous, colonial, all intertwined. The story of statehood did not erase the deeper story, it merely added another chapter. What makes Kentucky's ancient era so significant is not simply its age, but its continuity. The land shaped human behavior long before politics entered the picture. Geography dictated movement, resources defined value, shared use fostered both cooperation and conflict. These patterns did not disappear with European settlement, they evolved. The state that emerged in 1792 inherited the geographic realities that had guided Paleo-Indian hunters and Mississippian farmers alike. Rivers still connected communities, fertile valleys still attracted settlement, strategic locations still invited competition. As Kentucky stepped into its new identity as an American state, it did so atop thousands of years of human experience. Its frontier narrative, often told as a story of heroic exploration, rests on foundations built by forgotten generations. To understand Kentucky fully, one must look beneath the cabins and forts, beneath the treaties and proclamations, into the deeper currents of adaptation and resilience that defined its earliest inhabitants. The ancient land never truly disappeared. It remains in the shape of the hills, in the course of the rivers, in the hidden chambers of Mammoth Cave. It remains in the paths that became roads, and in the fields that were once forest. Kentucky's beginnings stretch far beyond written record, rooted in memory carried by Earth itself. And as the frontier era unfolds in the next chapter, those ancient foundations will continue to shape every step forward. Number 2. Frontier Gateway. By the time Kentucky entered the late 18th century, it no longer stood as untouched wilderness. It had become a doorway, a threshold between the settled East and the vast interior of North America. The Appalachian Mountains, once seen as a wall, were slowly turning into a passage. Through narrow gaps and winding valleys, settlers pushed westward, carrying tools, livestock, and ambition. Among these routes, the Cumberland Gap became the most famous. It was not a road in the modern sense, but a natural corridor carved through mountains over ages of geological pressure and animal migration. To those seeking new land, it represented possibility. To those already familiar with the region, it symbolized growing intrusion. Kentucky was no longer simply land. It was becoming a gateway. Daniel Boone's journeys gave this gateway a human face. Though not the first European to enter Kentucky, Boone became its most recognized explorer. In 1769, he and a small party traveled through the Cumberland Gap into central Kentucky. They encountered fertile valleys, open meadows, and abundant wildlife. Boone described the region as rich beyond expectation. His accounts, carried back east, fueled imagination. Land speculators and settlers listened closely. They saw Kentucky not as contested territory, but as opportunity waiting for claim. Boone's fame grew, and with it, the steady stream of families determined to cross the mountains. The establishment of the Wilderness Road marked a turning point. Built largely along buffalo traces and indigenous paths, it became the primary route into Kentucky during the 1770s. Thousands traveled this narrow, rugged trail. Wagons often could not pass. Families walked beside pack animals, carrying what they could. The journey was dangerous. Steep slopes, unpredictable weather, and the constant risk of attack made each mile uncertain. Yet the promise of land ownership outweighed fear. For many settlers, Kentucky offered something increasingly scarce in the East: space. Wide tracts of fertile soil that could be farmed and passed down through generations. Boonesboro, founded in 1775, became one of the earliest permanent settlements. Built as a fortified station, it reflected the tension of frontier life. Cabins were arranged within protective walls. Guards stood watch. Daily life required constant vigilance. Farming, hunting, and defense existed side by side. Similar stations, Harrodsburg, Logan's Fort, and others, appeared across the region. These were not peaceful villages, but defensive communities. The frontier was not empty land waiting quietly. It was land contested, claimed, and defended. Conflict with native nations intensified as settlements expanded. Raids occurred on both sides, driven by fear and resistance. For indigenous groups, the rapid growth of permanent European settlements threatened not just hunting grounds but sovereignty itself. For settlers, survival depended on holding ground. Stories of captivity, attack, and escape became part of frontier legend. The violence hardened attitudes and deepened divisions. Kentucky's gateway status meant it stood at the front line of cultural collision. The American Revolution further complicated Kentucky's frontier story. Though distant from the main eastern battlefields, Kentucky became strategically significant. British forces, allied with certain native nations, sought to slow colonial expansion by targeting frontier settlements. Raids increased, stations were attacked, supply lines became vulnerable. Yet the settlements endured. The Revolution transformed Kentucky from distant frontier into symbol of American westward determination. Defending Kentucky meant defending the future of expansion. Land speculation accelerated during this period. Investors and companies claimed vast tracts, often before proper surveys were completed. Overlapping claims created confusion and legal disputes. Surveyors marked boundaries using trees and rivers, but records were sometimes vague. Land ownership in early Kentucky was rarely simple. Families who believed they had secured property sometimes found themselves challenged by distant speculators holding conflicting documents. The dream of opportunity came with uncertainty. Kentucky's fertile promise was shadowed by legal complexity. Despite instability, migration continued steadily. By the 1780s, thousands of settlers had crossed into Kentucky. Farms replaced forest clearings. Tobacco and corn became staple crops. Livestock grazed where bison once roamed. Rivers carried flatboats loaded with produce downstream toward markets in New Orleans. Trade routes strengthened Kentucky's economic position. What had been frontier stations began evolving into organized towns. Lexington grew rapidly, becoming cultural and political center of the region. Yet Kentucky remained legally part of Virginia. Distance from Richmond made governance difficult. Settlers felt isolated from eastern political structures. discussions of separation began early. Many believe Kentucky's interests differed from those of coastal Virginia. Security, land laws, and economic priorities required local control. Conventions were held to debate statehood. Over time, the idea gained support. Kentucky was no longer merely frontier outpost, it was growing into political entity. Frontier life shaped a distinct character. Independence became necessity. Communities relied on cooperation for survival. Skills in hunting, farming, and defense defined respect. Women played vital roles, managing households under constant pressure and sometimes defending stations during attacks. Children grew up quickly in an environment where labor and vigilance were daily realities. Kentucky's early society valued resilience. The land demanded it. Religion also spread across the frontier. Camp meetings drew large gatherings, where emotional preaching and communal worship offered comfort amid uncertainty. These gatherings strengthened community bonds and laid foundations for future religious influence in Kentucky culture. Spiritual life, once rooted in indigenous connection to landscape, was now expressed through Protestant revivalism that echoed across open fields. By 1792, Kentucky achieved statehood, becoming the 15th state in the Union. This milestone symbolized its transformation from contested frontier to recognized political body. Yet statehood did not erase frontier identity. Violence along borders continued for years. Land disputes persisted. Native displacement left deep scars. But the gateway had fully opened. Kentucky stood as proof that settlement could cross mountains and reshape interior lands. The frontier era defined Kentucky's trajectory. It established patterns of agriculture, trade, and governance. It created legends of exploration and survival. It forged a population accustomed to balancing risk with ambition. The Cumberland Gap, once just a mountain passage, had become symbol of American expansion. Kentucky was no longer ancient shared ground. It was the doorway through which a nation stepped westward, and the consequences of that movement would shape everything that followed. As Kentucky settled into its role as a frontier gateway, the flow of migration did not slow, it intensified. Families arrived not just from Virginia and North Carolina, but from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and beyond. Many were veterans of the Revolutionary War, granted Western lands as payment for service. Others were small farmers squeezed by rising land prices in the East. Kentucky represented renewal. Here, soil was deep and dark, capable of yielding strong harvests. Rivers connected farms to distant markets. The idea of independence, owning land, shaping community, building from nothing, pulled thousands across the mountains despite the risks. With growth came organization. Counties were carved out of wilderness. Courts were established to handle disputes. Militias were formalized for protection. Lexington, often called the Athens of the West, emerged as intellectual center. Schools opened, newspapers began circulating. What had been a cluster of defensive stations evolved into structured society, yet frontier memory lingered. Many residents had personally survived raids or lost family members in violence. That shared hardship created a collective identity rooted in resilience. Kentucky's gateway function was no longer just geographic, it was cultural, bridging raw frontier survival with emerging refinement. Agriculture quickly became foundation of prosperity. Corn thrived in Kentucky's fertile soil, and surplus grain encouraged distilling. Whiskey production expanded rapidly, eventually developing into what would be known as bourbon. The limestone-filtered water of central Kentucky gave the spirit distinctive character. Distilling transformed excess crops into valuable trade goods that could be transported efficiently by river. At the same time, tobacco farming expanded, tying Kentucky to broader Atlantic markets. Slavery, already present during the frontier era, grew alongside these agricultural systems. Though Kentucky never developed plantation density like the Deep South, enslaved labor became integral to certain regions and industries. River LTJR shaped Kentucky's economic integration. The Ohio River connected farmers to markets in Pittsburgh and beyond, while the Mississippi River opened routes to New Orleans. Flatboats loaded with pork, flour, hemp, and whiskey drifted downstream. Commerce flowed outward, and goods flowed back in. This connectivity strengthened Kentucky's strategic importance. It was no longer isolated frontier. It was active participant in national trade networks. Towns along riverbanks flourished, especially Louisville, whose position near the falls of the Ohio made it key transportation hub. Yet Kentucky's gateway status also created tension. Positioned between North and South, it absorbed cultural influences from both. Migrants from southern states brought traditions tied to plantation economy and slavery. Migrants from the upper South and mid-Atlantic carried different political views and economic priorities. This mixture produced complexity. Kentucky was southern in many customs, yet geographically connected to free states across the Ohio River. The boundary was physical and symbolic. Ideas crossed as easily as goods. Debates over slavery, federal power, and economic development simmered quietly, foreshadowing future divisions. Political leaders from Kentucky began gaining national prominence. Henry Clay, born in Virginia but rising to power in Lexington, became one of the most influential statesmen of the early 19th century, known as the Great Compromiser. Clay worked tirelessly to balance sectional tensions between North and South. His American system proposed economic modernization through infrastructure and protective tariffs. Clay's prominence reflected Kentucky's own identity, positioned between regions, often seeking moderation rather than extremes. Through figures like Clay, Kentucky shaped national dialogue, not just frontier narrative. Meanwhile, westward expansion did not stop at Kentucky's borders. As settlers moved further into Ohio, Indiana, and beyond, Kentucky shifted from edge of civilization to established interior state. Yet its role as gateway remained historically significant. Many migrants passed through Kentucky before continuing west. Roads improved, river ports expanded. The state functioned as staging ground for deeper expansion into the continent. Kentucky had opened the door, and now others walked through it. Conflict with native nations gradually diminished within Kentucky's boundaries as displacement became permanent. However, the memory of that conflict lingered in stories and local identity. Frontier forts became historical landmarks. Figures like Daniel Boone transformed into legends, symbols of courage and exploration. These stories often simplified complex realities, portraying settlement as heroic inevitability rather than contested transformation. Over time, myth blended with memory, shaping how Kentuckians understood their own origins. Education and culture expanded alongside economic growth. Transylvania University attracted scholars and students from across the region. Churches multiplied. Camp meetings continued drawing large gatherings, especially during the Second Great Awakening. Religious revivals swept through Kentucky in the early 1800s, reinforcing moral structures and community bonds. Spiritual fervor blended with frontier independence, producing a distinct cultural atmosphere. Kentucky was no longer raw wilderness, yet it retained emotional intensity shaped by its early struggles. By the 1820s and 1830s, Kentucky stood firmly established within the United States. Its economy was diversified. Agriculture, distilling, livestock, and river LTJR all thriving. Its political influence extended to Washington. Its towns reflected refinement as well as frontier memory. Yet beneath growth lay unresolved contradictions. Slavery remained legal. Economic inequality widened between wealthy landowners and small farmers. Appalachian regions in the east developed differently from bluegrass regions in the center. Kentucky's gateway role had brought opportunity, but also complexity. The transformation from ancient land to frontier gateway had reshaped everything. Indigenous pathways had become migration roads. Hunting grounds had become fenced farms. Seasonal camps had become permanent towns. The Cumberland Gap, once quiet mountain passage, now symbolized unstoppable expansion. Kentucky had fulfilled its role as doorway to the west. But gateways do more than allow passage. They shape those who cross them. And Kentucky itself was being shaped, politically, economically, and culturally, into a state that stood balanced between worlds.
That balance would soon be tested. As the 19th century moved forward, Kentucky's identity as a frontier gateway
slowly evolved into something more complicated. The rush of migration that once defined the state began to flow past it. New territories opened farther west, and pioneers who once would have settled in Kentucky now pressed onward toward Missouri, Arkansas, and Texas. Kentucky, once edge of expansion, became middle ground, yet its legacy as passageway did not fade. Roads that had carried wagons west now connected established towns. River ports grew busier. The state matured, but the memory of movement remained woven into its character. Economic growth deepened regional contrasts within Kentucky. The bluegrass region in central Kentucky thrived with fertile soil ideal for tobacco and hemp production. Wealth accumulated among landowners who relied on enslaved labor to sustain agricultural output. Elegant homes rose across rolling pastures. Horse breeding gained prominence, with thoroughbreds becoming symbols of prestige. Meanwhile, eastern Kentucky's Appalachian terrain developed differently. The mountains limited large-scale plantation farming, leading to smaller farms and more isolated communities. These geographic differences shaped political attitudes and economic realities, creating internal diversity that would later influence how Kentucky responded to national crises. Slavery's presence in Kentucky remained significant but distinct from the Deep South. The state never became dominated by vast cotton plantations, yet enslaved individuals formed essential labor force in many areas. Kentucky's proximity to free states across the Ohio River made it both slave state and border state. Escape routes developed quietly. The Underground Railroad passed through parts of Kentucky assisted by both free black communities and white abolitionists. At the same time, many Kentuckians defended slavery as economic necessity and social order. The contradiction defined the state, connected to southern systems yet geographically tied to the north. Politically, Kentucky continued producing influential leaders. Henry Clay's role in crafting national compromises reflected the state's balancing position. The Missouri Compromise and later the Compromise of 1850 aimed to maintain fragile unity between slave and free states. Kentucky supported unionism strongly during this period, valuing stability and national connection. Many citizens saw themselves first as Americans, rather than strictly Southerners. Yet cultural ties to Southern neighbors remained deep. Churches, social structures, and agricultural systems aligned closely with the South. The tension was quiet but persistent. Transportation advancements strengthened Kentucky's integration into national markets. Railroads expanded during the mid-19th century, linking inland towns to river ports and neighboring states. Louisville grew into a major commercial center, blending Southern tradition with industrial ambition. Factories appeared alongside warehouses. Steamboats churned along the Ohio River, carrying goods and passengers in steady flow. The gateway had transformed from mountain trail to rail line, from buffalo trace to steel track. Movement remained constant, only the technology had changed. Cultural identity matured alongside economic growth. Horse racing gained national recognition, culminating in the establishment of the Kentucky Derby in 1875. Though its roots lay earlier in the century's fascination with thoroughbreds, bourbon production expanded into organized industry. What began as frontier distilling became refined craft. These industries tied Kentucky's name to recognizable symbols: speed, skill, and flavor. The state's image blended rustic heritage with cultivated tradition, yet beneath prosperity, unease lingered. National debates over slavery intensified during the 1850s. The Fugitive Slave Act heightened tensions along the Ohio River. Escaped enslaved individuals crossed into free states just miles away, while slave catchers pursued them under federal law. Kentucky's border location made it frontline in moral and political conflict. Communities divided quietly. Some citizens sympathized with abolitionist ideas. Others feared economic collapse if slavery ended. The balance Kentucky had long maintained grew increasingly fragile. As the nation edged towards civil war, Kentucky's strategic importance became undeniable. Control of its rivers and railroads would mean control of vital supply lines.
Both Union and Confederate leaders understood this clearly. Kentucky attempted neutrality when war erupted in 1861, declaring it would not side with either North or South. The declaration reflected its long-standing desire to remain balanced, but neutrality proved impossible. Armies soon crossed its borders, battles scarred its fields, families split in loyalty. The gateway once used for westward migration now became corridor for marching troops. The Civil War marked the end of Kentucky's frontier-era identity. No longer primarily passageway for settlers, it became battleground of divided nation. Though it officially remained in the Union, many Kentuckians supported the Confederacy. The state embodied national fracture. Its internal diversity, geographic, economic, cultural, manifested in divided allegiances. The conflict revealed that Kentucky's balancing act, maintained for decades, could not withstand the force of sectional war. When the war ended, Kentucky stood changed. Slavery was abolished through the 13th Amendment. Though the state had resisted ratifying it initially, Reconstruction unfolded differently here than in deeper southern states, yet racial inequality persisted. The frontier gateway had become established border state, shaped by conflict and compromise. Its early role as corridor for expansion remained central to its history, but its future would now be shaped by industry, coal, railroads, and modern politics, rather than wagon trails. Looking back, the frontier gateway era defined Kentucky's transformation. It shifted from ancient shared hunting ground to strategic passage for a growing nation. It absorbed migrants, cultivated farms, produced leaders, and stood at crossroads of ideology. Geography made Kentucky a bridge. History made it a battleground of ideas. Its gateway role forged resilience, but also planted seeds of division. The mountains still stood, rivers still flowed, but the meaning of those landscapes had changed forever. And as Kentucky moved into its next chapter, the challenges of unity, industry, and identity would test it in entirely new ways. Number 3. Statehood and early growth. When Kentucky became the 15th state in 1792, it stepped into the Union with confidence shaped by frontier endurance. The long struggle for separation from Virginia had reflected a growing desire for local control. Distance from Eastern governance had made administration difficult, and settlers believed their needs differed from those along the Atlantic coast. Statehood was not merely symbolic, it was practical. It allowed Kentucky to craft its own laws, manage land disputes directly, and strengthen internal defense. The new constitution outlined political structure rooted in Republican ideals, though voting rights remained limited primarily to white male property owners. Kentucky had crossed from frontier territory into recognized political entity, but its society still carried the rugged imprint of its early years. Frankfort was chosen as the state capital, positioned along the Kentucky River. Its central location offered accessibility to growing counties. Government buildings rose where forest had stood only decades earlier. Legislators debated issues of taxation, infrastructure, and militia organization. Land claims continued to cause legal complications, with overlapping surveys still disputed in courts. Establishing stability required careful management of property records and enforcement of state authority. Kentucky's leadership understood that credibility depended on order. The frontier reputation of lawlessness had to give way to dependable governance if economic growth were to flourish. Agriculture quickly anchored the young state's prosperity. The fertile bluegrass region proved especially productive. Tobacco became a leading cash crop, shipped downriver to national and international markets. Hemp production also expanded, used for rope and textiles essential to maritime trade. Corn thrived across Kentucky's rolling fields, and surplus grain encouraged widespread distillation. Bourbon production grew steadily, becoming both economic engine and cultural marker. The limestone-rich water, filtered naturally through rock layers, gave Kentucky whiskey its distinctive smoothness. What began as frontier practicality evolved what began as frontier practicality.
evolved into organized industry as Kentucky entered the early 19th century. Small farm distilleries multiplied across the countryside, each producing barrels of whiskey that could be easily transported along river routes. Unlike bulky grain, distilled spirits were compact and profitable. Flatboats carried Kentucky bourbon down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers to New Orleans, where it found eager markets. Trade networks strengthened the state's economy and reputation. The same rivers that once carried native trade canoes and pioneer boats now moved commercial goods in steady volume. Kentucky was no longer isolated, it was economically interwoven with a growing nation. As prosperity expanded, towns matured into centers of refinement. Lexington developed reputation for culture and education, earning its nickname the Athens of the West. Transylvania University attracted scholars, lawyers, and political thinkers. Printing presses circulated newspapers that connected citizens to national debates. Public discussions about federal power, banking systems, and westward expansion filled meeting halls. Kentucky's early growth was not purely agricultural, it was intellectual as well. Leaders emerged who would shape American politics far beyond state lines. The frontier spirit remained, but it was increasingly paired with structured civic life and ambition. Louisville, positioned along the falls of the Ohio, became commercial powerhouse. Its location required boats to unload cargo before navigating the rapids, turning the city into vital transfer point. Warehouses, markets, and shipyards lined the riverfront. Merchants prospered by coordinating trade between interior farms and distant cities. As steamboat technology improved in the early 1800s, river travel became faster and more reliable. Louisville's growth reflected Kentucky's broader transformation, from remote frontier to integrated economic hub. Movement remained central to the state's identity, but now it was powered by steam rather than muscle. Yet growth carried social complexity. Slavery expanded alongside agricultural success. Enslaved men, women, and children labored on tobacco farms, hemp fields, and in domestic service. Though Kentucky did not mirror the vast cotton plantations of Mississippi or Alabama, slavery remained embedded in its economy and legal structure. The Ohio River, forming Kentucky's northern border, separated slave state from free territory. Across that water lay Ohio, a free state. The physical closeness of freedom heightened tension. Some enslaved individuals attempted escape across the river, aided quietly by abolitionists. Others endured harsh realities within a system that limited mobility and autonomy. Political debates increasingly reflected this duality. Kentucky's leaders often advocated compromise at the national level, mirroring the state's own balancing act. Henry Clay, rising to prominence during this era, embodied Kentucky's moderating influence. His efforts to preserve the Union through legislative compromise reflected both national ambition and state identity. Kentucky valued unity, fearing that sectional division would disrupt trade and stability. Yet beneath the rhetoric of compromise, underlying disagreements about slavery and economic direction persisted quietly within communities. Religious revival also shaped early Kentucky society. The Second Great Awakening swept through the region in the early 1800s. Massive camp meetings drew thousands to open fields, where emotional sermons and collective worship created intense spiritual experiences. Cane Ridge in particular became famous for its revival gathering in 1801. These events strengthened social bonds and moral frameworks within frontier communities. Churches multiplied across counties, providing structure and shared values. Faith became central to public life, influencing attitudes toward education, temperance, and even debates about slavery. Meanwhile, infrastructure slowly improved. Roads were widened and maintained more systematically. Bridges replaced unreliable crossings. Though still rural by modern standards, Kentucky was investing in connectivity. Improved transportation strengthened internal trade and communication between regions. However, differences between central Kentucky's prosperous bluegrass farms and the rugged Appalachian East became more visible. Eastern communities, limited by mountainous terrain, remained more isolated and economically modest. Geography once again shaped opportunity, reinforcing internal diversity within the state. By the 1830s and 1840s, Kentucky had fully shed its frontier vulnerability, yet it retained frontier memory. Farms were established, towns organized, institutions rooted. Children growing up during this era knew stories of Indian raids and wilderness survival from grandparents who had lived them. That memory fostered pride in endurance and self-reliance. Kentucky saw itself as strong, capable, and strategically important. It was both southern and western, traditional yet progressive in certain ambitions. National expansion continued pushing beyond Kentucky's borders. As new territories entered the Union, debates about whether they would allow slavery intensified. Kentucky watched carefully. Its economy depended partly on slave labor, yet it did not share the Deep South's single-crop dependency. Many citizens hoped compromise would prevent war. The state's position as border region made neutrality appealing, but increasingly unrealistic. Statehood had brought order and opportunity. Early growth had delivered prosperity and influence, but beneath economic expansion lay unresolved contradictions. Kentucky's identity as bridge between regions would soon face its greatest test. The next chapter would not be shaped by crops or commerce alone. It would be shaped by division. By the middle of the 19th century, Kentucky stood firmly established, yet increasingly uneasy. Its farms were productive, its towns expanding, and its political leaders influential on the national stage. But the balance that had defined Kentucky since statehood, between North and South, freedom and slavery, industry and agriculture, was growing fragile. The national conversation had shifted from compromise to confrontation. Each new state admitted to the Union reignited debate over slavery's expansion. Kentucky, bound economically to slave labor yet geographically tied to free states, felt the strain more sharply than most. The Ohio River became more than trade artery, it became symbolic dividing line. On one shore stood Kentucky, where slavery was legal. On the other stood Ohio, where it was not. Enslaved individuals looked across narrow stretches of water toward possibility. Some attempted the dangerous crossing under cover of darkness. The Underground Railroad developed quiet routes through northern Kentucky, assisted by free black communities and sympathetic abolitionists. At the same time, slaveholders demanded stricter enforcement of fugitive slave laws. Tension settled into daily life, subtle but constant. The river that connected markets also separated moral worlds. Economically, Kentucky continued diversifying. Hemp, tobacco, corn, and livestock sustained its prosperity. Horse breeding expanded further, solidifying the bluegrass region's national reputation for thoroughbreds. Fairs and racing events attracted visitors from neighboring states. Louisville's commercial growth accelerated with rail expansion, blending river trade with emerging industrial activity. Kentucky was not stagnant, it was evolving, yet its progress could not insulate it from the storm gathering across the nation. Politically, Kentucky leaders attempted moderation. Many citizens valued the Union deeply and feared disintegration. The memory of revolutionary unity and the benefits of national trade reinforced loyalty to the United States, yet cultural ties to southern neighbors complicated that loyalty. Family connections stretched into Tennessee and Virginia. Agricultural systems mirrored southern practices. Churches and social structures reflected shared traditions. Kentucky did not fit neatly into either section. It embodied the nation's internal contradiction. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in 1860, southern states began seceding. Kentucky hesitated. Its legislature debated intensely. Secessionists argued that southern rights required defense. Unionists insisted that leaving the United States would bring economic disaster and instability. Many ordinary citizens simply feared war. In 1861, Kentucky declared neutrality, attempting to avoid choosing sides. It was a bold but fragile stance.
Both the Union and Confederacy understood Kentucky's strategic importance. Its rivers, railroads, and central location could determine military success. Neutrality quickly collapsed. Confederate forces entered the state, followed soon by Union troops. Kentucky officially sided with the Union, though support within the population remained divided. Some Kentuckians joined Confederate regiments, others enlisted in Union ranks. Families split loyalties, communities argued fiercely. The state that had once served as gateway for expansion now became corridor for marching armies. Battles such as Perryville in 1862 scarred its fields. Guerrilla warfare erupted in rural areas, creating instability beyond formal battle lines. The Civil War exposed Kentucky's dual identity more clearly than ever before. Though it remained in the Union, it was deeply Southern in sympathy. Slavery persisted in Kentucky even after the Emancipation Proclamation, because the proclamation applied only to rebelling states. It was not until the ratification of the 13th Amendment in 1865 that slavery officially ended within Kentucky. The state initially resisted ratifying the amendment, reflecting lingering attachment to old systems. Freedom arrived not through local initiative, but through national constitutional change. The war left Kentucky economically strained and socially divided. Infrastructure had been damaged. Political trust weakened. Though Reconstruction policies were less intense in Kentucky than in former Confederate states, racial inequality and resentment remained strong. Many white Kentuckians resented federal intervention, even though the state had not seceded. Newly freed African Americans faced enormous challenges: limited economic opportunity, legal discrimination, and social hostility. The end of slavery did not bring immediate equality. Yet despite hardship, Kentucky retained resilience shaped by its earlier frontier history. Communities rebuilt, agriculture resumed, trade revived along rivers and railroads. The state began adjusting to a new era, one no longer defined by westward migration, but by industrial growth and shifting social structures. Coal deposits in eastern Kentucky, long known but not fully exploited, would soon attract national attention. Railroads would push deeper into Appalachian hills. The state's next transformation would come not from wagons crossing mountain gaps, but from industry carving through rock. Looking back, the period of statehood and early growth established Kentucky's foundational character. It balanced prosperity with contradiction, moderation with division. It produced leaders who sought compromise even as forces around them hardened into extremes. It prospered agriculturally while wrestling morally with slavery. Its geography made it bridge. Its politics made it battleground of ideas. By the end of the Civil War, Kentucky had completed another transformation. It was no longer frontier gateway, nor simply young agricultural state. It had endured national fracture and emerged still within the Union, though scarred and divided. The frontier had shaped its courage. Statehood had shaped its ambition. War had shaped its identity. And now, as the 19th century advanced, Kentucky would enter an age of coal, railroads, and industrial struggle, an era that would redefine its mountains, its cities, and its people once again. As the 19th century moved forward, Kentucky stepped into an era shaped not by frontier settlement or Civil War division, but by industry. The mountains of eastern Kentucky, once barriers to expansion, became sources of immense economic potential. Beneath those rugged ridges lay vast coal deposits. What had once limited growth now promised prosperity. Railroads carved through valleys and tunneled through rock, linking isolated Appalachian communities to national markets. Steam locomotives replaced riverboats as the primary engines of movement. Kentucky was entering the industrial age. Coal mining transformed eastern counties. Small farming settlements evolved into company towns almost overnight. Mining corporations purchased land, built worker housing, and established stores that often operated under company credit systems. For many families, coal offered steady wages in regions where agriculture had been unreliable. Yet the work was dangerous. Miners labored underground in unstable tunnels filled with dust and risk.
Explosions, collapses, and long-term respiratory illness became tragically common. Economic opportunity came at human cost. Meanwhile, western and central Kentucky diversified further. Tobacco remained a staple crop, but manufacturing expanded in Louisville and other cities. Bourbon production grew more standardized, developing brand identities that reached national and international markets. The state's horse industry flourished, with Kentucky Derby's first race held in 1875 at Churchill Downs. The event symbolized refinement and tradition, contrasting sharply with the harsh labor conditions of coal camps. Kentucky's identity continued to hold contrasts: elegance and endurance, wealth and hardship. The late 1800s also brought labor unrest. Coal miners organized to demand safer conditions and fair wages. Tensions between miners and coal operators sometimes erupted into violent conflict, particularly in the Appalachian region during the early 20th century. Armed confrontations, strikes, and federal intervention revealed deep fractures in industrial Kentucky. These struggles were not isolated incidents. They reflected national patterns of labor versus corporate power. But in Kentucky's narrow mountain hollows, conflict felt intensely personal. Families depended on mines even as they protested them. Transportation improvements continued reshaping society. Railroads connected rural producers to urban consumers. Telegraph lines transmitted information rapidly, reducing isolation. Cities modernized with electric lighting and streetcars. Education systems expanded, though access remained unequal, particularly for African Americans in the era of segregation. After Reconstruction, Kentucky adopted Jim Crow laws that enforced racial separation in public life. Though the state had remained in the Union, it developed systems of discrimination similar to those in the Deep South. The promise of freedom after the Civil War remained limited by institutional inequality. The early 20th century brought both optimism and challenge. During World War I, Kentucky contributed soldiers and industrial resources to the national effort. Coal production increased to meet wartime demand. After the war, the 1920s delivered economic highs for some sectors, but agricultural markets fluctuated unpredictably. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, Kentucky suffered deeply. Coal demand dropped, farms struggled, and unemployment rose sharply. Rural poverty intensified, especially in Appalachia. Federal New Deal programs in the 1930s brought relief and transformation. Infrastructure projects improved roads, schools, and public buildings. The Tennessee Valley Authority extended electricity into rural areas, modernizing daily life. For many Kentucky families, electricity arrived for the first time during this era, changing work patterns and home routines permanently. Government investments softened the Depression's harshest effects, though recovery was gradual. World War II once again shifted the state's trajectory. Kentucky's strategic location and resources supported military training and supply operations. Fort Knox gained national prominence, becoming a symbol of American financial security as the United States bullion depository safeguarded gold reserves. Industrial production increased, and many Kentuckians served overseas. The war stimulated economic growth and accelerated migration from rural counties to urban centers. After 1945, Kentucky entered the modern era. Highways replaced rail as dominant transportation routes. Suburban development expanded around cities. Coal remained significant, but mechanization reduced labor needs, displacing many mining families. Economic transitions created cycles of prosperity and hardship. Civil rights movements of the 1950s and 1960s challenged segregation. Kentucky, though sometimes less visibly turbulent than Deep South states, confronted its own racial inequalities. Schools and public facilities gradually integrated, reflecting national legal changes and local activism. Number 4. Border tensions. By the early 19th century, Kentucky stood in a fragile position. It was no longer a frontier, yet it was not fully Southern in identity. The Ohio River marked more than a boundary of water. It marked a dividing line between free states and slave states. On one side lay Ohio, where slavery was outlawed. On the other stood Kentucky, where slavery remained legal and deeply woven into the economy. This border created constant tension. Enslaved people could sometimes see freedom across the river. For slaveholders, that river represented risk. For abolitionists, it represented hope. And for Kentucky's leaders, it represented a political challenge that grew sharper each year. Slavery in Kentucky was different from the Deep South. Large plantations existed, but many slaveholders owned fewer than 10 enslaved people. Slavery was common, but not always concentrated in massive estates. Still, it shaped agriculture, labor, and social hierarchy. Tobacco and hemp farming relied heavily on enslaved labor. As America expanded westward, the question of slavery's expansion followed. Each new territory forced debate. Would it enter the Union as free or slave? These arguments shook Congress and stirred anger across the nation. Kentucky, located between North and South, felt these pressures intensely. One of the state's most influential voices during this time was Henry Clay. Born in Virginia but politically rooted in Kentucky, Clay became a national figure. He believed deeply in preserving the Union. His goal was compromise, not division. Clay helped craft the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This agreement attempted to balance free and slave states to prevent conflict. For a time, it worked. But it did not solve the deeper issue. It only delayed confrontation. Kentucky citizens were divided in their views. Some defended slavery as essential to the economy and tradition. Others quietly questioned its morality. A small but vocal group supported gradual emancipation. Yet open abolitionism remained rare within the state. The Ohio River became part of the Underground Railroad network. Enslaved individuals risked everything to escape northward. Some crossed at night in small boats. Others followed secret paths guided by sympathizers. Freedom was close, yet incredibly dangerous to reach. Slave catchers operated along the border. Fugitive slave laws required cooperation in returning escaped individuals. Tension grew between Kentucky slaveholders and northern abolitionists. Accusations, anger, and distrust deepened. Meanwhile, national politics intensified. The Compromise of 1850 once again attempted to settle sectional disputes. It strengthened the Fugitive Slave Act, angering northern states while trying to satisfy the South. Kentucky supported compromise, but compromise was becoming fragile. In towns and farms across Kentucky, conversations grew sharper. Newspapers reflected divided opinions. Political speeches stirred crowds. The language of union and states' rights became more heated. Economic ties complicated loyalties. Kentucky traded heavily with both North and South. River commerce linked it to Midwestern markets. Cultural traditions connected it to Southern neighbors. The state stood in the middle, geographically and politically. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 reopened the slavery debate by allowing territories to decide for themselves. Violence erupted in bleeding Kansas. Many Kentuckians watched closely. Some even migrated west to influence the outcome. By the late 1850s, compromise felt increasingly impossible. Abraham Lincoln's rise alarmed many slaveholding states. Though Kentucky did not immediately embrace secessionist ideas, fear spread that Southern influence was weakening. Churches, families, and political groups experienced quiet strain. Loyalty to the Union competed with loyalty to Southern social order. Kentucky's identity grew more uncertain. The election of 1860 became a turning point. 4 major candidates split the national vote. Kentucky largely supported John Bell, who ran on preserving the Union. This reflected the state's desire to avoid conflict. But history was about to change. As southern states began seceding after Lincoln's victory, Kentucky hesitated. It did not rush toward separation, nor did it fully embrace the northern position. The state hoped to remain neutral, yet neutrality in a divided nation was difficult to maintain. The border that once symbolized balance was becoming a fault line, and nothing would ever be the same. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Kentucky declared neutrality. State leaders hoped to avoid bloodshed on their soil. They asked both Union and Confederate forces to stay out. For a brief moment, it seemed possible. But neutrality could not survive long in a nation at war. Both the Union and the Confederacy understood Kentucky's strategic importance. Its rivers, railroads, and central location made it vital. Control of Kentucky meant control of key supply routes. Confederate troops entered the state first, violating neutrality. Union forces quickly followed. Kentucky was pulled into the conflict whether it wished to be or not. The state government remained officially loyal to the Union. However, many citizens supported the Confederacy. Families divided. Brothers sometimes fought on opposite sides. Communities fractured under pressure. Battles erupted across Kentucky soil. The Battle of Mill Springs in 1862 marked an early Union victory. The Battle of Perryville later that year became one of the war's bloodiest engagements in the state. Though Kentucky never officially seceded, a Confederate shadow government formed and was recognized by the Confederacy. For a time, two competing visions of Kentucky existed simultaneously. Enslaved people faced uncertainty during the war. Some escaped to Union lines seeking protection, others remained bound under existing laws. Freedom was near but not yet secured. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 freed enslaved people in Confederate-controlled territories. Because Kentucky remained in the Union, the proclamation did not immediately apply there. This created deep irony. A slave state loyal to the Union continued allowing slavery while Confederate states faced emancipation. Yet beneath the surface, something deeper was happening. As Union armies moved through the South, enslaved people in Kentucky increasingly sought freedom. The institution of slavery began weakening in practice even before legal abolition. The war strained Kentucky's economy. Farms were damaged, trade was disrupted, young men were lost in battle. When the war ended in 1865, Kentucky remained in the Union, but its internal wounds were deep. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery nationwide. Kentucky initially resisted ratifying it. Many white citizens felt resentment toward federal authority despite having remained loyal to the Union. Reconstruction unfolded differently in Kentucky than in the Deep South. There was no military occupation, yet social tensions were intense. Formerly enslaved people built new lives. Churches and schools became centers of community. Hope rose cautiously. At the same time, racial hostility hardened. Black codes and later segregation laws limited freedoms. Equality existed on paper, but reality was harsher. Politically, Kentucky began leaning more Southern in sympathy after the war, even while remaining legally part of the Union. The border state had survived the storm, but not without change. Its position between North and South had defined its destiny. The Ohio River still flowed quietly, but the meaning of that river had changed forever. Number 5 Civil War divide. When the Civil War began in 1861, Kentucky attempted something almost impossible. It declared neutrality. State leaders announced that Kentucky would join neither the Union nor the Confederacy. It would allow no armies to cross its borders. It hoped to remain untouched, but geography refused to cooperate. Kentucky sat at the center of the divided nation. The Ohio River formed a boundary with free states to the north. Tennessee lay to the south. Railroads, rivers, and supply routes made the state strategically priceless. Both sides understood this clearly. Citizens were deeply divided. Many Kentuckians believed the Union must be preserved at all costs. Others felt strong cultural and economic ties to the South. Loyalty was not determined by location alone. It was shaped by belief, family, and identity. In some households, fathers supported the Union, while sons volunteered for Confederate service. Brothers chose opposite uniforms. The war did not simply split the country, it split families. President Abraham Lincoln recognized Kentucky's importance. He reportedly said that losing Kentucky would be nearly the same as losing the entire war. Control of the state could determine the outcome of the conflict in the Western theater. In September 1861, Confederate forces entered southern Kentucky, breaking the state's declared neutrality. Within days, Union troops moved in response. The experiment with neutrality ended abruptly. Kentucky was now fully part of the war. Although the official state government remained loyal to the Union, Confederate sympathy remained strong in many regions. A Confederate shadow government was even formed and admitted symbolically into the Confederacy. For a time, two versions of Kentucky existed, one Union, one Confederate. Major battles soon followed. The Battle of Mill Springs in early 1862 delivered an important Union victory. Later that year, the Battle of Perryville became one of the bloodiest engagements fought on Kentucky soil. Smoke rose over farmland. Artillery thundered across quiet valleys. The war was no longer distant news, it was immediate and personal. More than 100,000 Kentuckians eventually served in Union forces. Approximately 40,000 fought for the Confederacy. The numbers reveal the depth of division within the state. Railroads were seized for military use, crops were confiscated. Livestock disappeared to feed marching armies. Civilian life became unstable and uncertain. Enslaved people watched events closely. Some fled to Union lines, hoping that military protection might lead to freedom. Others remained on farms, waiting for change that seemed close but uncertain. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 transformed the war's purpose. However, because Kentucky remained officially in the Union, the proclamation did not immediately free enslaved people within the state. This created a painful contradiction. A slave state loyal to the Union continued permitting slavery, while Confederate states faced emancipation under federal order. Guerrilla warfare added another layer of tension. Small bands of fighters carried out raids, sabotage, and retaliation in rural areas. Fear often lingered long after armies had moved on. Churches continued to gather. Markets reopened when possible. But beneath ordinary routines, anxiety never fully disappeared. By 1864, Union control over Kentucky was firm. Confederate forces had largely withdrawn. Yet the emotional divide remained sharp. Kentucky had tried to stand between two worlds. Instead, it became proof that standing in the middle could be the most dangerous position of all. By the final years of the war, exhaustion had settled across Kentucky. The early rush of marching armies and dramatic battles gave way to something quieter but heavier: uncertainty. Farms struggled to recover from repeated troop movements. Fences had been torn down for firewood. Fields had been trampled. Supplies were scarce. Although large Confederate forces had retreated, guerrilla warfare intensified in many rural counties. Small, loosely organized bands carried out raids, ambushes, and revenge attacks. These were not formal battles with clear lines. They were sudden, personal, and often brutal. Neighbor began to suspect neighbor. Accusations of disloyalty could result in arrest or violence. Union authorities imposed martial law in parts of the state, attempting to maintain control. Loyalty oaths were required. Newspapers were monitored. Order was enforced, but tension remained. Enslaved people continued seeking opportunities for freedom. Many fled plantations and farms, making their way toward Union camps. Others enlisted in the United States colored troops once recruitment opened to black soldiers. Thousands of African American men from Kentucky joined the Union cause. Yet even as black soldiers fought for the Union, slavery legally remained in Kentucky. The Emancipation Proclamation had freed enslaved people in Confederate states, but not in Union border states like Kentucky. This contradiction deepened resentment among many white Kentuckians. Some believed the federal government was slowly interfering with their internal affairs. Others feared economic collapse if slavery ended suddenly. When the war finally ended in April 1865, Kentucky had not experienced the total destruction seen in parts of the Deep South. Its cities still stood. Its farms were damaged but not annihilated. Yet socially and politically, the state had been transformed. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery nationwide in December 1865. Kentucky initially refused to ratify it. The state would not formally approve the amendment until more than a century later, in 1976. Freedom came immediately in law, but equality did not. Formerly enslaved families began building independent lives. Churches became centers of stability and leadership within black communities. Schools were established wherever possible. Education represented opportunity and protection. At the same time, resistance hardened. Many white citizens who had supported the Union during the war now opposed federal Reconstruction policies. They felt that Washington was reshaping Southern society too aggressively. Unlike former Confederate states, Kentucky was not placed under full military Reconstruction. However, racial inequality quickly took legal form through black codes and later segregation laws. Social separation became structured and enforced. Politically, Kentucky's identity shifted in the years after the war. Though it had remained in the Union, sympathy for the Confederacy grew stronger over time. Monuments and memorials reflected this shift in memory and narrative. The war had ended, but its emotional divide remained. Kentucky was still a border state, not just in geography, but in mindset. It had fought against itself. It had tried to remain neutral. It had failed, and the consequences would shape its future for generations. The guns had fallen silent, but the divide endured. Harpak kolong karo jitna hoskai pagraphs kilent bari karo. Next number, 6, Reconstruction era. When the Civil War ended in 1865, Kentucky stood in a complicated position. Unlike the former Confederate states, it had never officially seceded from the Union. Its government had remained loyal to Washington, yet slavery had existed within its borders until the very last months of the war. This unusual status shaped everything that followed. Kentucky was legally a Union state, but socially and economically, it shared many characteristics with the defeated South. The ratification of the 13th Amendment abolished slavery across the United States, instantly transforming the lives of nearly 225,000 enslaved people in Kentucky. Freedom arrived not gradually, but suddenly through constitutional authority. Plantations and farms that had depended on enslaved labor now had to confront a new labor reality. For formerly enslaved families, emancipation meant the right to marry legally, to control their labor, to reunite with relatives who had been sold away, and to move without permission. Yet freedom came without land, without wealth, and without protection from hostility. Many white Kentuckians reacted to emancipation with resentment rather than acceptance. They had not experienced military defeat in the same way as states farther south, yet federal amendments forced dramatic social change upon them. Kentucky's legislature initially resisted the 13th Amendment and later opposed the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted citizenship and voting rights to African American men. This resistance revealed how deeply slavery had been embedded in the state's political culture. Because Kentucky had not seceded, it was not placed under federal military reconstruction. There were no Union generals governing its cities, no formal readmission process to the Union. However, the absence of military oversight did not mean the absence of conflict. Instead, change unfolded unevenly, often shaped by local power structures that favored white control. Formerly enslaved Kentuckians moved quickly to establish independent institutions. Churches became central pillars of community life. Independent black congregations formed across the state, offering spiritual strength and practical support. Schools were organized with the assistance of northern missionary groups and the Freedmen's Bureau, though resources were limited. Education was seen as essential for survival and advancement in a hostile environment. The Freedmen's Bureau played a modest but important role in Kentucky. It helped negotiate labor contracts between freed people and former slaveholders. It established schools and provided legal assistance when possible. Yet its influence was limited compared to its presence in the Deep South. Many white citizens opposed its involvement, viewing it as federal interference. Economically, the transition from slavery to wage labor proved difficult. Some freedmen and freed women entered sharecropping agreements, working land owned by former masters in exchange for a portion of the crop. Others sought work in towns and cities, particularly in Louisville and Lexington, where opportunities, though limited, were broader than in rural counties. Domestic service, agricultural labor, and manual trades became common forms of employment. Violence and intimidation were persistent realities. White supremacist groups, including branches of the Ku Klux Klan, emerged in parts of Kentucky during the Reconstruction years. Their goal was to maintain white dominance and suppress black political participation. Threats, assaults, and acts of terror were used to discourage African Americans from voting or asserting legal rights. Despite these dangers, black Kentuckians participated in political life when possible. After the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870, African American men gained the right to vote. Political organizing began cautiously. Though representation remained limited, the act of voting itself was a powerful symbol of change. Meanwhile, many white Kentuckians who had supported the Union during the war began shifting politically. Resentment toward federal authority and fear of racial equality pushed the state toward more conservative positions. Over time, Kentucky's cultural identity aligned more closely with the South, despite its wartime loyalty to the Union. Public memory of the Civil War began to take shape during Reconstruction. Monuments, speeches, and commemorations often emphasized Confederate sacrifice rather than Union loyalty. This shaping of memory influenced how future generations understood the conflict. The narrative of Kentucky as a southern state grew stronger during these years. Infrastructure and agriculture slowly recovered from wartime disruption. Tobacco production resumed as a central economic driver. Hemp farming continued in certain regions. Railroads expanded gradually, connecting markets and improving transportation. Economic rebuilding, though uneven, moved forward. Education systems developed slowly for both black and white citizens, though segregation soon became entrenched. Separate schools for African American children were underfunded and overcrowded. The promise of equal citizenship under the Constitution did not translate into equal public investment. By the mid-1870s, Reconstruction as a national project was fading. Federal enforcement of civil rights weakened. In Kentucky, white Democratic leadership regained stronger control over state politics. Laws reinforcing segregation and racial hierarchy became more firmly established. For African Americans in Kentucky, Reconstruction was a period of both hope and hard reality. Legal freedom had been secured, citizenship had been recognized. But social equality remained distant. Progress required resilience, organization, and faith. For the state as a whole, Reconstruction deepened internal contradictions. Kentucky had avoided secession, yet it embraced many Southern racial policies. It had remained in the Union, yet it increasingly identified culturally with former Confederate states. The ERA left a lasting imprint. It reshaped labor systems, political alliances, and racial dynamics. It also demonstrated that the end of war does not guarantee unity. Kentucky entered the late 19th century carrying the legacy of emancipation, resistance, adaptation, and unresolved tension. The battlefield years were over, but the struggle over identity, power, and equality had only entered a new phase. By the late 1870s, Reconstruction as a national movement was drawing to a close. Federal troops withdrew from southern states, and the political will in Washington to enforce civil rights protections steadily weakened. In Kentucky, where federal oversight had already been limited, this shift further strengthened local control. White political leaders consolidated authority, and the brief window of expanded black political participation began to narrow. Segregation hardened into law and custom. Public facilities, transportation, schools, and even cemeteries became separated by race. These practices were not always immediate or uniform, but over time, they solidified into a system that would define Kentucky society for decades. Though Kentucky had not been formally reconstructed under military rule, it gradually adopted racial policies similar to those of the former Confederacy. For African American communities, adaptation required resilience and strategic organization. Churches remained the foundation of community life. Ministers often served as educators, political advocates, and social leaders. Independent black schools expanded slowly despite limited funding. Education was viewed not merely as advancement, but as protection against exploitation. Black-owned businesses began to appear in urban areas, especially in Louisville. Barbershops, grocery stores, funeral homes, and small trade operations created modest economic independence.
Though discrimination restricted growth, entrepreneurship became an important survival strategy.
Politically, African American voters participated where they could, but intimidation and structural barriers reduced their influence. Polling locations could be hostile environments. Economic pressure was sometimes used to discourage political involvement. Over time, participation declined as enforcement of voting protections weakened. Meanwhile, Kentucky's broader economy continued evolving. Agriculture remained central, particularly tobacco production. However, fluctuations in crop prices created instability. Farmers often depended on credit, tying them to cycles of debt. This economic pressure contributed to the rise of populist movements demanding reform. Railroad expansion accelerated during the late 19th century. New lines connected rural counties to commercial centers, reducing isolation and encouraging trade. Towns along rail routes experienced growth, while areas left off the lines sometimes declined. Transportation shaped opportunity unevenly across the state. Industrial development also expanded gradually beyond agriculture. Small manufacturing operations appeared in cities. Louisville strengthened its position as a regional economic hub. Warehouses, processing plants, and river commerce created jobs and attracted migrants from rural counties. In eastern Kentucky, coal extraction began increasing in scale toward the end of Reconstruction. Though the region had long been economically isolated, outside investors now recognized the value of Appalachian resources. Land purchases by coal companies began reshaping mountain communities. This economic transition introduced new tensions. Local farmers sometimes sold mineral rights without fully understanding long-term consequences. Outside corporations gained significant control over land and labor. The seeds of future industrial conflict were being planted quietly during these years. Socially, Kentucky's identity continued shifting. Although it had remained loyal to the Union during the Civil War, public memory increasingly emphasized Southern heritage. Confederate veterans organizations gained influence. Monuments erected in public spaces reflected selective remembrance of the war. Education for white citizens expanded more rapidly than for black citizens. Public school systems grew in structure and organization, though rural areas still lagged behind cities. Literacy rates gradually improved, shaping a more informed electorate and workforce. Women's roles also evolved slowly during this period. Though excluded from formal political power, women played active roles in church organizations, education advocacy, and social reform movements. Temperance campaigns and charitable efforts often relied on female leadership. By the 1890s, the Reconstruction generation had largely passed from direct political influence. A new generation inherited a state marked by freedom without equality, growth without uniform prosperity, and memory shaped by selective narratives. For African Americans, Reconstruction had delivered constitutional rights but limited enforcement. For white Kentuckians, it had delivered social change accompanied by lingering resentment. For the state overall, it marked a transition from war recovery to industrial ambition. The contradictions of the era did not disappear. They hardened into structures that would define the early 20th century. Segregation, economic inequality, and regional imbalance became embedded realities. Yet despite division, communities endured, families rebuilt, institutions strengthened, railroads extended further into valleys and hills. Kentucky emerged from Reconstruction not unified, but stabilized. The war had ended, freedom had been declared, but the meaning of that freedom would continue to be debated for generations. As the 19th century moved toward its final decade, Kentucky entered what historians often call the Gilded Age, a period of rapid economic expansion, visible wealth for some, and deep inequality for many. The legacies of Reconstruction did not disappear. Instead, they blended into new industrial and social transformations that reshaped the state's future. Industrial growth accelerated in urban centers. Louisville expanded as a commercial powerhouse along the Ohio River. Its port activity, warehouses, tobacco processing plants, and manufacturing facilities drew workers from rural Kentucky and neighboring states. The city's skyline began to reflect brick factories, rail yards, and growing neighborhoods divided sharply along racial and class lines. In western Kentucky, tobacco remained king. Farmers relied heavily on the crop, but falling prices and monopolistic buying practices created frustration. Large corporations increasingly controlled processing and distribution, limiting the power of small growers. This imbalance would later spark organized resistance movements among farmers who felt trapped by unfair systems. Meanwhile, eastern Kentucky experienced dramatic transformation as coal mining expanded. Railroads pushed deep into the Appalachian Mountains, opening previously isolated communities to industrial extraction. Coal camps appeared almost overnight. Company-owned towns controlled housing, stores, and wages. Miners were often paid in company scrip rather than cash, tying them economically to the very corporations that employed them. These mining regions brought together diverse groups: local Appalachian families, African American migrants, and European immigrants. While this diversity created complex communities, it also generated tension. Dangerous working conditions, long hours, and low pay would eventually fuel labor disputes in the decades ahead. Urban African American communities continued to grow, especially in Louisville and Lexington. Segregation remained firmly entrenched, but black institutions strengthened. Newspapers, mutual aid societies, fraternal organizations, and educational initiatives created networks of support. Leaders within these communities advocated for civil rights, economic advancement, and dignity despite systemic barriers. Education slowly expanded statewide, though inequality persisted. Kentucky established more structured public school systems, but funding varied dramatically between wealthy and poor counties. Black schools remained under-resourced. Still, literacy rates steadily improved, laying groundwork for future activism and opportunity. Politically, Kentucky settled into Democratic dominance by the late 19th century. Although the state had been divided during the Civil War, political power now leaned heavily toward conservative leadership that supported segregation and limited federal intervention. This alignment reinforced Kentucky's cultural identification with the South. Public memory continued to shape identity. Confederate monuments rose in courthouse squares. Veterans' reunions celebrated Southern valor. Over time, the narrative of Kentucky as a Southern state overshadowed its Union loyalty during the war. Memory became a powerful force in defining belonging. At the same time, reform movements began emerging quietly. Populist ideas gained traction among struggling farmers who opposed railroad monopolies and corporate control. Temperance campaigns sought to limit alcohol consumption. Women's clubs advocated for education, public health, and eventually suffrage. These efforts planted seeds for progressive change in the early 20th century. Technological change also altered daily life. Telegraph lines improved communication. Rail travel shortened distances. Industrial tools increased production capacity. Though rural areas remained slower to modernize, the sense of connection to national markets grew stronger. Yet beneath progress lay unresolved tensions. Racial segregation was solidifying into the Jim Crow system. Economic disparity between industrial centers and rural counties widened. Appalachian communities faced exploitation by outside investors. Political power remained concentrated among a limited elite. By the turn of the century, Kentucky was no longer defined solely by its Civil War experience. It had entered an industrial era shaped by coal, tobacco, railroads, and urban growth. But the war's legacy, questions of identity, race, power, and memory, still influenced every institution. Reconstruction had promised transformation, the Gilded Age delivered expansion, but equality remained unfinished business. Kentucky stepped into the 20th century carrying both opportunity and contradiction, a state balancing between mountains and rivers, industry and agriculture, progress and prejudice. The next century would test whether growth could finally overcome division. Number 7. Early 20th century and progressive era. As the 20th century began, Kentucky stood at a crossroads between tradition and modernization. The state was no longer recovering from the Civil War. It was now confronting the challenges of industrial growth, political reform, and social change. Railroads crisscrossed the landscape. Coal mines expanded deeper into the Appalachian Mountains. Cities grew louder, busier, and more crowded. Yet large parts of rural Kentucky still lived much as they had in the 19th century. Industrialization reshaped daily life. In eastern Kentucky, coal mining became the dominant force in the regional economy. Company towns controlled nearly every aspect of miners' lives, from housing and stores to schools and law enforcement. Workers often lived in small wooden houses owned by the mining company, purchased food from company stores, and were paid in scrip that could only be spent locally. This system created economic dependence and limited personal freedom. Working conditions in the mines were dangerous and exhausting. Explosions, collapses, and black lung disease were constant threats. Long hours underground left miners physically drained. As production increased to meet national demand for coal, labor tensions grew. Workers began organizing quietly, seeking better wages and safer conditions. In western Kentucky, tobacco farmers faced different but equally serious challenges. Large tobacco trusts controlled pricing and distribution, squeezing small farmers into financial hardship. In response, some farmers formed protective associations to demand fair prices. These efforts sometimes escalated into violence known as the Black Patch Wars, where mass groups intimidated those who refused to cooperate with collective action. The conflict revealed deep frustration with corporate power. Urban centers like Louisville continued expanding. Factories produced manufactured goods, warehouses handled river trade, and neighborhoods spread outward. Electricity gradually entered homes and businesses. Streetcars improved transportation within cities. Though progress was uneven, modernization was unmistakable. At the same time, the progressive movement began influencing Kentucky politics. Across the nation, reformers sought to address corruption, improve public health, regulate industry, and expand democracy. In Kentucky, progress came slowly but steadily. Leaders pushed for better roads, stronger public education systems, and government accountability. Public education reform gained attention during this era. Kentucky worked to standardize schools and improve teacher training. Rural education remained underfunded, but reformers believed schooling was essential for economic growth and civic responsibility. High schools became more common in towns and cities. Public health initiatives also expanded. Efforts to reduce disease, improve sanitation, and regulate food safety reflected national trends. In both urban and rural areas, campaigns promoted hygiene and vaccination. Though medical resources were limited, awareness of health as a public responsibility grew. Women played an increasingly visible role in reform movements. Through church groups, temperance organizations, and civic clubs, women advocated for cleaner cities, improved schools, and moral reform. These networks strengthened the foundation for the women's suffrage movement, which would soon reshape political participation. For African Americans in Kentucky, the early 20th century was marked by both institution building and continued discrimination. Segregation laws remained firmly in place. Public facilities, schools, and transportation were divided by race. Yet black communities continued strengthening their own schools, businesses, and cultural organizations. Leaders pushed for advancement despite systemic barriers. Racial violence remained a painful reality. Lynching and mob intimidation occurred during this period, reinforcing white supremacy and limiting political progress. The promise of Reconstruction had faded into a system of enforced separation and inequality. Meanwhile, technological innovation began touching even rural communities. Telephones slowly spread. Agricultural tools improved productivity. Automobiles appeared on dirt roads, at first as rare sights, and then more common symbols of change. Politically, Kentucky remained divided between reform-minded leaders and those resistant to change.
Corruption in local politics was not uncommon, and power structures often protected established interests. Yet gradual reform continued. By the 1910s, Kentucky was more connected to national trends than ever before. Industrial demand tied its coal and tobacco to broader markets. Reform movements linked it to nationwide progressive causes. The state was no longer shaped primarily by the memory of Civil War battlefields. It was now shaped by factories, mines, railroads, and reform campaigns. And soon, an event unfolding across Europe would pull Kentucky into a global conflict. In 1914, war erupted in Europe. At first, it felt distant from Kentucky's hills and river towns. Newspapers carried headlines about battles in places most Kentuckians had never heard of. But when the United States entered World War I in 1917, the conflict quickly became personal. Thousands of Kentucky men enlisted or were drafted into military service. Training camps were established, including Camp Zachary Taylor near Louisville, which became one of the largest training centers in the country. Soldiers from farms, mining towns, and city neighborhoods prepared for combat overseas. For many, it was their first time leaving the state. The war stimulated Kentucky's economy. Coal production surged to fuel ships, trains, and factories. Tobacco was in high demand for soldiers' rations. Industrial plants increased output. Farmers worked longer hours to meet supply needs. For a brief period, wartime demand brought economic energy and opportunity. Women stepped further into public roles during the war. With men overseas, women worked in factories, offices, and farms. Their visible contribution strengthened arguments for voting rights. In 1920, the 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote nationwide. Kentucky ratified the amendment, marking a historic shift in political participation. African American Kentuckians also served in the military, though in segregated units. Many hoped their service would strengthen claims for equal rights at home. At the same time, the Great Migration accelerated. African Americans left rural Kentucky for northern cities like Chicago and Detroit, seeking industrial jobs and escape from segregation. This movement reshaped both Kentucky communities and northern urban centers. When the war ended in 1918, returning soldiers faced a changing society. The 1920s brought both prosperity and tension. Urban areas experienced cultural shifts. Jazz music, cinema, automobiles, and consumer goods became symbols of modern life. Louisville reflected many of these trends, growing more industrial and diverse. Yet rural Kentucky often felt left behind. Many farming communities struggled with falling crop prices after wartime demand declined. Economic instability deepened the divide between urban growth and rural hardship. The coal industry remained central in eastern Kentucky, but labor disputes intensified. Miners organized through unions such as the United Mine Workers of America, demanding safer conditions and fair pay. Clashes between miners and coal companies sometimes turned violent, foreshadowing major labor conflicts in the decades ahead. The 1920s also saw the rise of prohibition, which outlawed the manufacture and sale of alcohol. Enforcement varied widely. In some areas, illegal production thrived in remote hills and rural counties. The law created new tensions between federal authority and local customs. Culturally, Kentucky continued balancing identities, Southern tradition, Appalachian heritage, and growing industrial modernity. Education slowly improved and literacy rates rose. Roads expanded, allowing automobiles to connect once isolated communities. However, beneath the surface optimism of the 1920s lay economic fragility. Overproduction in agriculture, unstable coal markets, and unequal wealth distribution created vulnerability. In 1929, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression began, and Kentucky, like the rest of the nation, would soon face one of the most difficult decades in its history. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, its impact on Kentucky was immediate and severe. The state had already been facing economic imbalance, struggling farmers, unstable coal markets, and uneven industrial growth. The crash exposed these weaknesses and deepened them. Banks failed across the state. Families who had saved money for years suddenly found their accounts frozen or gone. Businesses closed, credit disappeared. In rural counties, farmers who were already burdened with debt lost land to foreclosure. Tobacco prices collapsed. Livestock sales slowed. Many families survived only through subsistence farming, growing their own food and trading with neighbors. In eastern Kentucky, coal production plummeted as national demand dropped. Mines shut down. Thousands of miners lost their jobs. Company towns, once tightly controlled and economically dependent on coal corporations, now faced hunger and uncertainty. Without wages, families struggled to buy even basic necessities. Relief lines grew longer. Urban areas such as Louisville also suffered. Factories reduced production or closed entirely. Unemployment rose sharply. Bread lines and soup kitchens became common sights. The optimism of the 1920s vanished, replaced by anxiety and survival. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt became president and launched the New Deal, a series of federal programs designed to combat the Depression. For Kentucky, these programs proved transformative. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, employed thousands of young men, many from struggling rural families. They built parks, planted trees, improved roads, and worked on flood control projects. Their wages supported families back home. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, funded public construction. Schools, courthouses, bridges, and roads across Kentucky. These projects modernized infrastructure while providing employment. Artists, writers, and teachers were also employed under federal programs, documenting local culture and history. In eastern Kentucky, the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, brought electricity to rural communities that had never had it before. Dams were constructed to control flooding and generate power. Electrification transformed daily life, allowing for refrigeration, lighting, and new tools that increased productivity. The New Deal did not end hardship overnight, but it reshaped the relationship between Kentucky citizens and the federal government. For many, Washington was no longer distant. It was actively shaping local recovery. Labor movements gained strength during the 1930s. Coal miners organized more aggressively, demanding union recognition and better conditions. Tensions sometimes turned violent in what became known as the Coal Wars. Armed confrontations between miners and company-backed forces reflected the desperation of the time. For African American Kentuckians, the Depression brought disproportionate hardship. Discrimination limited access to many relief jobs. Segregation remained firmly in place, yet New Deal programs did provide some employment opportunities, and black institutions continued to support their communities. Women also played critical roles during the Depression. They managed households under extreme financial strain, took in boarders, preserved food, and worked when jobs were available. Their resilience often held families together during the darkest years.
By the late 1930s, signs of recovery began appearing. Infrastructure had improved. Rural electrification spread. Roads connected distant communities.
Schools were modernized. Though poverty remained widespread, Kentucky was more physically developed than it had been before the Depression. Then, in 1939, war once again erupted in Europe. When the United States entered World War II in 1941, Kentucky's factories, farms, and coal mines would shift into full wartime production. The Great Depression had tested Kentucky's endurance. World War II would test its unity, and the state would once again be drawn into a conflict that reshaped both its economy and its identity. Number 8. World War II and post-war transformation. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, Kentucky mobilized rapidly. The war effort pulled the state out of the lingering effects of the Great Depression almost overnight. Factories reopened. Coal mines increased production. Farms operated at full capacity. Unemployment dropped sharply as thousands of Kentuckians joined the armed forces or found work in defense industries. Military installations expanded across the state. Fort Knox became one of the nation's most important training centers for armored divisions. Camp Campbell, later known as Fort Campbell, grew into a major military base. Young men from Kentucky's cities, small towns, and mountain communities were trained and deployed to battlefields in Europe and the Pacific. Kentucky's coal was essential to the war machine. Mines in the Appalachian region operated at intense levels to supply energy for steel mills and transportation. Tobacco, livestock, and crops supported both soldiers overseas and civilians at home. Industrial plants in Louisville produced military equipment, including synthetic rubber and machinery parts. Women once again stepped into industrial roles, working in factories and offices, while men served overseas. Rosie the Riveter was not just a national symbol, she had a presence in Kentucky as well. Wartime labor shortages created opportunities that had been unavailable to many women before. African American Kentuckians also contributed significantly to the war effort, serving in segregated military units and working in defense industries. However, discrimination remained deeply rooted. Segregated facilities persisted both in the military and at home. Still, the war planted seeds for future civil rights activism, as returning black veterans demanded the freedoms they had defended abroad. The war also brought population shifts. Rural residents moved to cities for industrial jobs. Military bases attracted new communities. Economic growth reshaped urban landscapes, especially in Louisville. When the war ended in 1945, Kentucky, like the rest of the nation, faced a transition from wartime production to peacetime life. Soldiers returned home to families and communities that had changed during their absence. Many used benefits from the GI Bill to attend college, buy homes, or start businesses. Higher education enrollment expanded significantly during these years. The post-war era marked the beginning of suburban growth. Housing developments expanded outside major cities. Automobiles became central to daily life. Road construction increased to support growing traffic. Kentucky's transportation networks modernized rapidly. Industry diversified beyond coal and tobacco. Manufacturing expanded in sectors such as chemicals, appliances, and automotive components. Louisville strengthened its position as a regional economic hub. However, not all regions experienced equal prosperity. Eastern Kentucky's dependence on coal created vulnerability. Mechanization in mining reduced the need for labor, leading to job losses despite steady production. Economic disparity between urban and Appalachian areas widened. The war had unified the state around a common purpose. The post-war years brought prosperity, but also revealed structural inequalities that would soon demand attention. Kentucky was entering a new era, one shaped by economic expansion, Cold War anxieties, and growing calls for civil rights. The late 1940s and 1950s brought rapid transformation to Kentucky. The optimism of victory in World War II blended with the tension of the Cold War. National defense remained a priority, and military installations like Fort Knox and Fort Campbell continued playing major roles in both training and strategic planning. Kentucky became firmly tied to America's global posture during this era. Economically, the state experienced strong growth. Manufacturing expanded, especially in Louisville, where factories produced appliances, automotive parts, and industrial equipment. The Ohio River remained a vital transportation route, supporting trade and industry. Suburban neighborhoods spread outward as returning veterans purchased homes through GI Bill benefits. Automobiles reshaped daily life. Highways and improved road systems connected once isolated towns to urban centers. In 1956, the Federal Aid Highway Act initiated the construction of the interstate highway system. Kentucky's network of interstates gradually linked it more closely to national markets, encouraging business development and mobility. Education expanded dramatically in the post-war period. Colleges and universities grew as veterans pursued higher education. The University of Kentucky and the University of Louisville saw rising enrollment. Public high schools became more standardized, and literacy rates continued improving statewide. Yet beneath prosperity, racial segregation remained firmly embedded in law and custom. Kentucky, though technically a border state, maintained segregated schools and public facilities. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education declared segregated public schools unconstitutional. This ruling directly affected Kentucky. Compared to some Deep South states, Kentucky's response to desegregation was more measured, but not without resistance. Integration occurred gradually, often under federal pressure. In some communities, tensions ran high as schools began admitting students of all races. The process was slow, uneven, and emotionally charged. African American leaders and organizations in Kentucky pressed the broader civil rights beyond school integration. They challenged discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations. Churches and community groups played central roles in organizing peaceful activism. Meanwhile, economic disparities in eastern Kentucky became more visible. Mechanization in coal mining continued reducing jobs. Many Appalachian communities struggled with poverty, limited infrastructure, and declining population as residents migrated to cities or out of state seeking work. The contrast between growing urban suburbs and struggling mountain towns widened sharply. Television entered Kentucky homes during the 1950s, connecting residents to national culture and political debate. News coverage of civil rights protests across the South influenced local conversations. The state was no longer insulated from national social movements. Agriculture also modernized. Mechanized equipment increased efficiency but reduced the need for farm labor. Small family farms faced difficulty competing with larger operations. Rural depopulation accelerated as younger generations moved towards cities. Politically, Kentucky balanced conservative traditions with gradual reform. Democratic leadership remained dominant at the state level, though national political alignments were beginning to shift. By the end of the 1950s, Kentucky had changed dramatically from its pre-war identity. Suburbs expanded, highways stretched across the state, industries diversified, and education levels rose. But questions of racial equality, economic fairness, and regional inequality were far from resolved. The 1960s would bring those questions directly into the spotlight. The 1960s brought Kentucky into one of the most transformative decades in American history. The civil rights movement, which had been building momentum for years, now reshaped laws, institutions, and daily life across the state. Although Kentucky had a reputation for being more moderate than some Deep South states, segregation and discrimination were deeply rooted. African American Kentuckians pushed for equal access to housing, employment, education, and public facilities. Sit-ins, marches, and organized protests took place in cities like Louisville and Lexington. In 1964, Louisville passed a local public accommodations ordinance banning segregation in many businesses, a major milestone. Later that same year, the Federal Civil Rights Act outlawed discrimination nationwide. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 further protected access to the ballot. These federal laws accelerated integration across Kentucky. School desegregation, which had begun slowly after 1954, moved forward more decisively during the 1960s. However, resistance did not disappear overnight. In some districts, tensions flared as communities adjusted to new realities. Over time, integration became more firmly established, though social divisions often persisted beneath the surface. Meanwhile, President Lyndon B. Johnson's war on poverty directly targeted regions like eastern Kentucky. Appalachian poverty had gained national attention, especially after images and reports revealed severe economic hardship in coal communities. Federal programs funded job training, healthcare clinics, school improvements, and infrastructure development. The Appalachian Regional Commission, ARC, created in 1965, invested in highways, education, and economic diversification. New roads improved access to isolated mountain counties. Though poverty did not vanish, federal investment brought long-term structural change. The coal industry continued evolving. While production remained important,
Mechanization reduced employment opportunities. Many former miners sought work elsewhere, contributing to outmigration from the Appalachian region. Urban centers grew as rural populations declined. The Vietnam War also touched Kentucky deeply. Thousands of Kentuckians served overseas. The conflict divided public opinion, especially among younger generations. College campuses became centers of debate and protest, reflecting national tensions. Culturally, Kentucky in the 1960s balanced tradition with change. Country music, Appalachian folk traditions, and Southern heritage remained strong cultural forces. At the same time, youth culture, rock music, and television influenced social attitudes. Women's roles continued expanding. The broader women's movement encouraged greater participation in professional careers and public life. Educational opportunities widened, and more women entered the workforce. By the early 1970s, Kentucky was significantly more integrated, more connected, and more modern than it had been just 2 decades earlier. Highways linked cities and counties. Universities expanded. Civil rights laws reshaped public institutions. Yet challenges remained. Economic inequality persisted between regions. Urban areas faced issues of housing and employment disparity. Appalachian communities continued struggling with limited economic diversification. The post-war transformation that began in the 1940s had reshaped Kentucky's landscape, physically, socially, and politically, from coal mines to courtrooms, from segregated schools to integrated campuses, from dirt roads to interstates. The state had moved through conflict toward gradual reform. But history never stands still. The late 20th century would bring globalization, political realignment, and new economic challenges that would once again redefine Kentucky's path. Number 9. Late 20th century change, realignment, and modern challenges. By the 1970s, Kentucky had entered a new phase of transformation. The civil rights battles of the 1960s had reshaped laws and institutions, but economic and political forces were now driving the next wave of change. The state faced questions that were no longer only about segregation or integration. They were about jobs, industry, identity, and the future of rural communities. The coal industry, long a pillar of eastern Kentucky's economy, entered a period of instability. While energy crises during the 1970s briefly increased demand for coal, automation continued reducing the need for miners. Massive machines replaced human labor. Production numbers could remain high even as employment declined. Entire communities that had depended on mining wages felt the strain. Outmigration accelerated. Young people left Appalachian counties seeking opportunities in Lexington, Louisville, or out of state entirely. Small towns struggled to maintain schools, hospitals, and local businesses. The population imbalance between eastern Kentucky and urban regions became more pronounced. At the same time, Kentucky worked to diversify its economy. Manufacturing expanded in the automotive sector. In the 1980s, Toyota established a major manufacturing plant in Georgetown, a transformative development. The arrival of global industry signaled Kentucky's integration into the modern international economy. Auto production and related supply chains created thousands of jobs. Louisville continued developing as a logistics and shipping hub. Its location along the Ohio River and its expanding airport infrastructure made it strategically important for national distribution networks. Transportation and warehousing grew into major economic sectors. Politically, Kentucky began experiencing realignment. For much of the 20th century, the Democratic Party had dominated state politics, especially at the local level. However, national political shifts, particularly around social issues, cultural identity, and federal policy, began influencing Kentucky voters. Over time, many rural and suburban areas leaned increasingly conservative in national elections, even while state-level politics remained more mixed. Education reform became a central issue. In 1990,
Kentucky passed the Kentucky Education Reform Act, KIERA, a sweeping overhaul of the state's public school system. The reform aimed to address funding inequalities between wealthy and poor districts, improve accountability, and modernize curriculum standards. It was one of the most ambitious education reforms in the country at the time. Healthcare access also gained attention, particularly in rural regions. Economic decline in parts of Appalachia made it difficult to maintain hospitals and medical services. State and federal programs sought to address gaps, but challenges persisted. Culturally, Kentucky maintained strong traditions, from the Kentucky Derby to college basketball rivalries. The University of Kentucky and the University of Louisville became not only educational institutions, but also symbols of regional pride, especially through sports. Meanwhile, urban centers dealt with their own complexities. Louisville and Lexington expanded economically but faced issues related to housing, racial inequality, and urban development. The legacy of segregation still influenced neighborhood patterns and economic opportunity. Environmental concerns also emerged more prominently. Coal mining practices, including mountaintop removal, raised questions about environmental protection versus economic necessity. Debates over land use, water quality, and long-term sustainability became more visible in public discourse. By the end of the 20th century, Kentucky was no longer defined primarily by tobacco and coal, though both remained significant. It had become a more industrialized, globally connected state, yet one still marked by regional inequality and cultural complexity. The foundations of the modern era were now firmly in place. But the 21st century would bring new forces: technological change, healthcare debates, shifting political coalitions, and economic restructuring that would once again test Kentucky's adaptability. As Kentucky entered the 21st century, globalization and technological change reshaped the state's economy in profound ways. Manufacturing remained important, particularly in the automotive sector, but automation and international competition forced companies to become more efficient. While major employers like Toyota continued operating successfully, job growth did not always match population needs, especially in rural areas. Coal, once the unquestioned backbone of eastern Kentucky, faced steep decline in the 2000s and 2010s. Competition from natural gas, environmental regulations, and market shifts reduced demand. Mines closed, employment dropped dramatically. Counties that had already experienced decades of job loss saw further economic contraction. Many communities struggled with shrinking tax bases and declining public services. The opioid crisis struck Kentucky particularly hard during this period. Prescription drug abuse and later heroin and fentanyl addiction devastated families across both rural and urban areas. Eastern Kentucky and parts of western Kentucky experienced high overdose rates. The crisis exposed weaknesses in healthcare access, economic stability, and social support systems. State leaders, healthcare providers, and community organizations launched initiatives to expand treatment and prevention programs, but the challenge remained severe. Healthcare policy became a major political issue. The expansion of Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act significantly increased healthcare coverage in Kentucky, particularly in low-income and rural communities. Debates over funding, eligibility, and long-term sustainability reflected broader national divisions. Politically, Kentucky's alignment continued shifting. While Democrats maintained influence in certain local and state offices for years, Republican candidates increasingly dominated federal elections. Cultural issues, economic frustration, and national political trends influenced voting patterns. By the 2010s, Kentucky had become reliably Republican in presidential elections, though state politics still reflected regional diversity. Urban areas continued growing and modernizing. Louisville expanded its logistics industry, becoming a major shipping hub due to UPS's global air hub at Louisville Muhammad Ali International Airport. Lexington strengthened its reputation as a center for education, healthcare, and the horse industry. These cities attracted investment and population growth.
Meanwhile, rural communities face persistent challenges: limited broadband access, hospital closures, school consolidation, and job shortages. Efforts to expand high-speed internet became a priority, seen as essential for economic development and educational access. Higher education institutions adapted to changing demands. Universities expanded research programs and workforce partnerships. Community and technical colleges played growing roles in retraining workers affected by industrial decline. Culturally, Kentucky continued balancing tradition and modernity. The Kentucky Derby remained an internationally recognized event. College basketball rivalries energized the state annually. Appalachian music and heritage festivals preserved regional identity, even as younger generations connected to global culture through digital media. Environmental issues remained central, particularly debates over coal, renewable energy, and land preservation. Some regions began investing in tourism, outdoor recreation, and alternative industries to diversify local economies. Natural disasters, including flooding in eastern Kentucky, highlighted infrastructure vulnerabilities and the long-term environmental effects of industrial practices. Recovery efforts required coordination between local, state, and federal agencies. By the 2020s, Kentucky was a state of contrasts: thriving urban hubs alongside struggling rural counties, advanced manufacturing plants alongside abandoned coal towns, strong cultural traditions alongside rapid technological change. The challenges were complex: economic transition, healthcare access, infrastructure modernization, and political polarization. Yet Kentucky had navigated transformation before, from frontier settlement to Civil War border state, from coal-powered industry to global manufacturing. Its history showed a pattern: adaptation under pressure. The question moving forward was not whether change would come, it was how Kentucky would shape that change, and who would benefit from it. Say next when you're ready for the final section. The 2020s opened with challenges few could have predicted. Like the rest of the nation, Kentucky was deeply affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. Hospitals faced strain, schools shifted to remote learning, businesses, especially small, locally owned shops and restaurants, struggled to survive during lockdowns and reduced activity. The pandemic exposed both strengths and weaknesses in the state's healthcare infrastructure, broadband access, and emergency preparedness. Rural communities faced particular difficulty with limited medical facilities and internet access for online education. At the same time, the crisis accelerated modernization. Telehealth expanded rapidly. Remote work became more common in urban areas like Louisville and Lexington. Investment in broadband infrastructure gained urgency, seen now as essential rather than optional. Economic recovery unfolded unevenly. Manufacturing rebounded in some sectors, especially automotive production and logistics. Louisville's role as a global shipping hub remained strong. Warehousing and distribution grew as e-commerce expanded nationwide, yet workforce shortages and supply chain disruptions created new pressures. In eastern Kentucky, devastating floods in 2022 highlighted environmental vulnerability and long-standing infrastructure challenges. Entire communities were damaged. Recovery efforts required state and federal coordination, and they renewed debates about land use, disaster preparedness, and long-term economic sustainability in Appalachia. Energy policy continued evolving. While coal production declined compared to its historical peak, it remained culturally and politically significant. At the same time, renewable energy projects, including solar installations, slowly expanded. Kentucky found itself balancing tradition with transition once again. Politically, polarization mirrored national trends. Urban and rural voting patterns diverged sharply. Public debates over healthcare, education policy, energy, and social issues became more intense. Yet state government continued focusing on economic recruitment, attracting new manufacturing plants,
battery production facilities and technology investments tied to the growing electric vehicle industry. Education reform and workforce training became central priorities. Leaders emphasized preparing students for advanced manufacturing, healthcare careers, and technical fields. Community colleges expanded partnerships with industry. The goal was clear: position Kentucky competitively in a rapidly changing national and global economy. Culturally, Kentucky remained deeply rooted in tradition. The Kentucky Derby continued drawing global attention each spring. College basketball remained almost a civic religion. Bourbon production experienced significant growth, turning the Bourbon Trail into a major tourism attraction. Tourism in general became an increasingly important sector, from horse farms in the Bluegrass region to outdoor recreation in Red River Gorge and Mammoth Cave. Demographically, the state faced gradual population shifts. Some rural counties continued losing residents, while metropolitan areas expanded. Efforts to revitalize small towns focused on entrepreneurship, tourism, and remote work opportunities. Throughout its modern journey, Kentucky has remained a place shaped by geography. Mountains in the east, rolling bluegrass in the center, river valleys in the west. That geography has influenced industry, culture, politics, and identity for centuries. From frontier settlements to Civil War border tensions. From coal booms to industrial realignment. From segregation to civil rights reform. From tobacco fields to global manufacturing plants. Kentucky's history is not a straight line. It is a series of adaptations to pressure, conflict, and opportunity. Today, the state stands as a blend of Appalachian resilience, Southern heritage, Midwestern industry, and modern innovation. Its past explains its divisions. Its endurance explains its survival. And its future, like its history, will depend on how it responds when the next wave of change arrives.